Okay, before we get started and before I introduce myself, can we have 2 volunteers to get you all involved and for me to talk a little less? Read your replies to the first section. Go ahead.
Okay. I had create a business case, define the scope, interviews, elicitation, process flows, determine this, or learn or determine the stakeholders, and create a business analysis plan.
Great. Anyone else?
Sure, it sounds similar, but articulate the objectives, identify the stakeholders, conduct focus groups, elicit requirements, and understand any constraints.
Okay, how many have something like that? How many have something you feel is fairly different? All right. One of the things I found out, I've given this survey in Pittsburgh, DC, and Baltimore. And one of the things I found out over time is the whole BA profession doesn't really know how to give a real short answer of what it does. So what I've done after having figured some of this out and been around for a little while, I've been doing the same thing in one form or another for 30 bloody years, even if it doesn't look like it. So I've added some bonus material at the end that I'm kind of excited about. Maybe it'll tie together a lot of the loose ends for what we do, just in case there's any lack of clarity. The whole profession, like I've said, seems to have it. So I've done a bunch of stuff. I'll go through some of it. I have a bunch of letters after my name. Big whoop. I have a new one of these. So I used to be like Gene Wilder when I was young, and I'm slowly becoming more like Peter Boyle. And we need sound. Well, there's supposed to be sound, there isn't any. Anyway, Gene very nicely walks around and sings and dances, putting on the Ritz, and then his monster goes, Now, I'm allowed to make that joke. If you make it, I get to rip your arm off, beat you over the head with it, and jam it in your ear. So anyway, I plotted what's happening to be on the Wilder-Boyle scale. So there's our boy Gene. There is Peter Boyle. That's from a movie called Swashbuckler. Young me wearing a horrible 80s jacket, I apologize. And current me. So I did the same thing originally with John Machida Jr., the world's fastest talking man, and Stephen Hawking. So that was the Machida Hawking skit. All right. One of the there are a lot of considerations in computer simulation. There are 3 main classes of it. There's analog, which can be electrical or mechanical or some hybrid. When it comes to using computers, there's discrete event, which is the one on the right there, and the one on the left is a continuous simulation. One is based on differential equations, usually processed in regular time steps. The other is based in time order, but they can be arbitrary length time steps. That doesn't matter. The main thing you need to know about simulation is you have to be able to analyze the heck out of a simulation in order to be able to create one and get usable, actionable data and decision support and knowledge out of it. So even though I started off as a mechanical engineer and I worked in paper, nuclear metals, and a lot of hardcore stuff, and even transportation, security, building evacuations. Really, I've also worked in insurance, financial stuff, legal stuff, all these same techniques, analysis, discovery, domain knowledge acquisition, process mapping especially. They all apply to every industry. So not always apparent. Some of the uses these things can be put to are, you can see the applications there. I love doing economic analysis. In particular, it's good for business case studies. You're basically attaching monetary value to everything you're doing and then multiply out and figure out, okay, here's how much this option costs, as well as many other outputs you might get. And then you change some, rerun the simulation and figure out, well, is that better or worse? Which is fundamentally what we as business analysts are trying to do. There are a few architectural considerations for simulation. The first one is continuous versus discrete event. I already covered that. The next one is interactive versus fire and forget. An interactive one is like a training simulator, flight simulator, a video game, what have you. Even full-scope nuclear power plant simulators. You do something in the middle of a simulation run and it changes its response. Fire and forget, you basically hit a button and walk away and it more or less does its thing without intervention. Real-time versus non-real-time. If you're doing a trainer with a human in the loop, you want that to be real-time. If you do real-time industrial control, which I've done in the metals industry, you want that to be real-time. Non-real-time, if you're simulating the formation of the solar system, probably don't want to run that real-time. That will take 5 billion years. Single platform versus distributed. Some things run on a desktop. Some things run on a whole pile of computers that are networked together and synchronized, and there's a lot of waypoints in between. We did nuclear power plant simulators on these old Gould cell computers that had 4 CPUs and shared memory, so it was an HPC set. And finally, deterministic versus stochastic. stochastic. Deterministic means you run it, it comes out the same every time. There is no variability. X inputs, X characteristics, X outputs. Stochastic, and this comes along with Monte Carlo simulation, is you run multiple trials with variations in different components and you get a range of outputs. So that gives you a really good idea of how to break down problems, how to do different computer architectures, a lot about computer science, a lot about analyzing problems, matching implementations and solutions to various problems. So my framework that I learned, it came from two things. It was a little bit inspired by the BAP, but not much. I guess the formal part of it came from a Navy simulation guide for BDNA, but mostly came from my own experience. Again, I've done this full life cycle on large projects and small in a lot of places, so I've had a chance to see every combination and permutation of these ideas. So it looks pretty straightforward. Never really says this in BAPOC, does it? And there's a reason for that. So the BAPOC itself is broken down into 6 sections which go across the top, left to right, and then my framework, these steps go top to bottom. So the things that are most associated with each other are with the heavy or accented marks, and the things you can make less of a case for but are still associated are darker ones or less emphasized. Now, you can make a case that there should be some kind of an X in almost every box. But the point is, you see it does go from top left to bottom right. So the BAPOC does sort of go in a flow. You ought to sort of do things in this order. Again, because so many things are so different in all the things various of us may do at any given time. The BAPOC can't say do that, do that, do that. It's a very general, diffuse toolbox. It sort of fits the flow. Alright, so project planning, that's pretty straightforward, almost out PMI's work, the PMBOK. There's a bookended closeout at the end if you're doing a project or in any kind of effort or engagement that has a beginning and end. If it's an ongoing effort, then it's going to be more like a program, but the same thing applies. The first thing you have to do with any project is, or any effort, is figure out what you're trying to get out of it. What's going to be the benefit? After that, you have to figure out what assumptions you're going to make, what are the risks, what are the capabilities, what do you have to do, what do you have to consider, and what do you have to not consider. This is online on my website. It's just in case you don't want to take notes.
And I'll send a link.
Thank you.
So the big thing with a simulation is coming up with a conceptual model. And that is basically your understanding of what's going on. In order to create that, you do discovery, data collection, and maybe domain knowledge acquisition. I'll get into those. A few of you may have heard me speak briefly on this a few months ago. So the conceptual model, and then you review this with the customer or the subject matter experts to make sure you're agreed that you're talking about the same things, that you haven't missed anything. Then we do data sources. So process mapping is basically discovering where you are identifying the nouns and verbs of a process or a system, right? And then data is what you use to characterize all the parts. Those are basically the adjectives. So you have to map the system to figure out what data you need to collect and how it all fits together. Now, this is something the BABA talks about a lot, and that you're all familiar with requirements. I've talked about a lot of things that can come before this. So in some sense, and this is how things are kind of loose with the BABA, is that requirements are part of the intended use, right? That drives what we're gonna try to do. That's a high level requirement. Here we're talking about lower level requirements for the implementation or the solution. And obviously we have a difference between functional and non-functional. Functional is what something does, non-functional is what something is. So functional provides the actual value. Mostly that does the processing, but the non-functional characteristic, they're equally important. They're usually described in terms of ability, like reliability, maintainability, flexibility, modularity, all that stuff. And then once you figure that out, actually, the conceptual model is the as-is state. So you've mapped out what the current situation is, and the requirements describe the to-be state in abstract terms. Next thing you do is come up with a proposed design. That may be driven by what's going on in technology, what's possible, individual knowledge, architectural specialties that your organization has developed. So if you do a certain kind of tool that's applicable to many problems, you'll go out and sell your services applying that tool to various kinds of problems. And ultimately, we keep track of all this in a requirements traceability matrix, ideally. And we'll get to that in a little bit more detail later. Implementation is where you're actually putting stuff together. Deployment is part of that for those of you working in DevOps and software type stuff. Now, this doesn't apply just to simulation or software projects. It's really trying to figure out any kind of project, any kind of process improvement, or what have you. This is something I play around with. What I think is most important for being able to solve a problem. One is understanding this framework. I think that may sound self-serving, right? On the other hand, I've looked at ways things have been done really well through my career, and times when I've seen things done really poorly, and I've seen everything in between. And I've tried to write about this on my blog previously, but as I've played with all this, all the ideas have been clarified in my mind quite a lot. And if people understood this hierarchy, I think they'd do a lot better. One of the things that I think is interesting is the actual tools. They're absolutely necessary. But in order to solve the problem, they're kind of less important. So if you're looking for someone to solve a problem, the programmer knows there's that language and that framework and that OS. Those are all important, but you can have that be great and go solve the wrong problem and you're still nowhere, right? And another way to draw this is with a series of boxes in a circle and all of them connected to everyone else. They're all important, the whole chain, and then you have to decide what's most important to you or your situation. I had a physics professor, and this links to an article I wrote that mentions him. He said in freshman physics class that when students get lost, they tend to turn on their calculator. This is back in the days with the HP handheld RPM calculators. Still have mine, love it, have one on my phone. Couldn't live without it. But he says the idea is that the calculator and being able to bang out numbers is not going to help you. You have to solve the problem abstractly before you ever put the numbers in. And the same is true with any of these. You really have to understand the problem and solve it abstractly before you ever try to really do the implementation. Testing is super important. There's two main parts of it. So operation and usability or verification, that means does the thing you build work the way you think it should and the way you meant it to. Validation is the other and more important part of that, and that is, did the thing you implement actually address the problem? Is it accurate? Does it use the right data? Does it provide the right output? The main thing here again, we talk about the RTM, it's really in every phase of this. And then provisions for doing testing and acceptance should be built into the process from the beginning. So all of you that have done Agile and Scrum, you all know this. It's definition of done, test, release, DevOps, CI/CD, whatever. A lot of these systems I did, it was just, I wrote it and put it on the customer's computer and it was done. So that was simple. But in other cases, it was way more complicated. Acceptance is the last part. Obviously, we can have full or non-distinct, get it out of here, or partial with limitations, and they may or may not allow you to fix them. So that's the basic process. Let's have two more people answer or share their steps from the second question. Anyone? Want to go?
I'm gonna defer to an EA.
Who's got the answers for that? Mimi.
Actually, some of the non-standard project I worked on was, this is the last job I had was, I have to get the requirements from the developers, if that would make sense. Because the developers were intimately involved with all the different benefits in detail. So that person knows a lot more about the design and overall scope than the actual user, who just not always reliable. They don't always have the long-term version. Oh, somebody's not making sense. So that's non-standard. Instead of getting it from the users, I got it from developers. And the managers.
Right.
Yes, the managers and directors.
Those are all valid.
They know the system so well.
That was one question I had blank. I said that was the one question I had
Okay.
blank.
We said, what is a standard?
Well, that's a good question. Let's do something different. How about name 3 software tools? Sure.
I am not okay, but Excel.
That's a great one. It's the most commonly given answer in the surveys I've done. Anything else? Okay. Great. For communication? Sure. Yeah. Also for communication and organization.
Confluence with Jira.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Live in it.
a lot of these things are about some calculation, but a lot of record keeping, keeping order, keeping things synchronized. So I did this slide. The idea is you sort of, once you get in the middle of a project, you sort of go round and around this loop. And you never really get out of it till the whole thing's finished. And if you think about it, as you're progressively elaborating things and doing an ongoing Agile or Scrum process, that's what you're doing when you're not at the beginning and end. All right, I talked about discovery and data collection. One interesting thing is the thing I've talked about so far is either applies to process improvement of an existing system or a simulation where you have an existing system you're trying to build. If you're trying to do something new from scratch, then the discovery is really mixed in with the design. So you're building something up and it's all mixed in together. Process mapping basically describes what goes in or what goes out, what happens to it, how it's transformed, what calculations are done, what storage happens, talks about the entities that are processed by the system, and so on. And there are a lot of different ways to do it. Here are drawings or simulations I've made at various places over a long period of time. This was my first engineering job. I'd worked with the CAD shop to lay out the equipment for a mechanical pulping mill. And basically, you take a bunch of logs, they were stripped, run them through a steamer and a chipper and a pressure feeder, and then run them through these 22,000 horsepower mechanical refiners that had like a 5-foot disc that would spin at about 1800 RPM, feed the chips in along the center spindle. They'd go out, they'd get ground up into shreds. And there were like 30 different characteristics to describe the state of paper that comes out of that. So knowing the processes, the kinds of wood, energy, economics, equipment, the kind of paper you're trying to make, those are all subject matter expertise or domain knowledge from the from that industry. Another thing that's on here is the state of the paper as it's going from one place to another. I won't be so detailed on the rest. So that's an off-gas system for a nuclear power plant. I simulated this for a full-scope power plant training simulator where they built a replica of the simulator, the whole control room, every panel, button, switch, knob, dial, recorder, indicator, and what have you. And instead of being hooked to the plant, they had to be hooked to a computer simulation that did a first principles simulation of everything important that happened in that plant that was reflected on one of those control room panels. And this was a super complicated system. It was too complicated for what I knew at the time, but I sure learned a lot, did a pretty decent job on it. This is a tool we built called Border Wizard, and it builds simulations. So we would discover what's going on at border crossings. I personally went to about 40. And these are the approved border crossings. They actually have facilities, not fences, not tunnels, not the middle of the desert, nobody pole vaulting over a wall, swimming across the Rio Grande, none of that. And this involved, I did this on and off for 13 years. I went to probably 40 different places on both sides of both borders, northern and southern, and even one on the southern border of Mexico. So I did the whole thing in building this tool and updating it for the Canadian and Mexican processes from the discovery and requirement through to actually using it. That's one I just did when I was building a discrete event simulation framework that I could use. I actually wrote it in JavaScript. I did like 40 of these to figure out what the common and simplest building blocks are. And there aren't many of them. If you look at any process, I talked about this before, there are inputs that come from sources and outputs that go to customers. Sometimes that flow will reverse, so that you have to have the code be ready to deal with that. Normally, a lot of subject matter areas, including the BABA, go forward from source to customer called sidepod. But you can also design in reverse from customer needs back to what you have to have in place to meet those needs. And if you think about it that way, it's COPUS. Not the BABA, but I learned that from another BA up in DC, and that I thought was a good insight. So in my framework, this is a bit hard to see. There are a small handful of very standard components. So ideally, the discovery, mapping, and breakdown of any process leads you to identify a small number of pieces. And you can figure out the general characteristics of any piece, reconfigure it, and so on. So it can stand in for many different processes. It's like building things out of Lego. So I want the smallest base number of pieces I can. When I get it down to that, I know I have a good theoretical understanding of the underlying system. So the whole thing is a system. There's an entry, there are processes, there are queues that store things up. There are combined queues and processes. So a queue is first in, first out, right? There are other kinds that are first in, last out. And there are also bags, which are arbitrary holders. If you look at a parking lot where people's residence time in that parking lot or their cars are driven by not what time they got in or out, but by something else that can be measured, then that's an example of that. And obviously entities go through it. A lot of times the entities are actually fluid, so it's a continuous flow. But in most cases, especially documents in a company or pieces of information, those are discrete entities. You'll see that picture again. Data collection, again, finding adjectives is also process characterization, like I talked about. I'm blowing through these kind of quick so I can get to the new ending stuff, which will be more interactive. When you're doing data collection, I've done all these things. and even many different versions of these things. A lot of these come under things that are talked about in the BABA, and some of them aren't. Domain knowledge acquisition, like I said, is looking at what's going on in that industry that you're working with. So you're bringing your ability to analyze systems and maybe build solutions, but one of the languages your customers talking, insurance has a language, banking has a language, every industry has its own language. Now sometimes you can learn from the subject matter experts as you go, and that's why you do the continuous review with them, make sure you're all agreeing and in saying go forward, review, iterate, and so on. Here's the requirements traceability matrix. Ideally, I mean, this is totally arbitrary. Things map right to left through the, left to right through the process. One to many or many to one doesn't really matter. But the point is, if you find anything new that hasn't been accounted for in a later stage, go back and add it to the previous stage, do another cycle of review, add it to the documentation, make sure everything is linked in both directions. Non-functional requirements coming here, usually they can crop up in other places, and these are down here just as an indication that there can be requirements for how you do this process itself. They don't come from the customer's process. They're rules about what you do. And you can do this using any tool you want, Word, Jira, anything like that, Excel. You can give numbers to things so you can always keep in sync and cross-reference. Here's the feedback cycle I told you about, pretty diagram. So go into the start, go around and around until you agree what's happening. Go to the next phase, same thing all the way through to acceptance. And if you find something you missed, you go back. What's another name for this? It applies to waterfall, when in theory, it's Agile and Scrum, right? And the main thing about Agile and Scrum, they don't really solve any problems for you. What they're really meant to do, their whole purpose, almost everything else is baggage, is to get people to talk to each other, to do this so they know and say, I know best, I'm gonna go off 3 different directions, but whatever the heck I feel like it, try to put it together all in the end and find out it's hopelessly broken. And frankly, you can do that in Scrum too. But if you do that, you want to be shot. And I've seen it happen. So that's a simulation running live. I haven't made it interactive. Here it's rendered in 3D, it's all in JavaScript. Can do this in any language or with a little prep. Alright, the thing I'm talking to you about right now is if I'm doing a full boat, I'm gonna, something big. I'm gonna do everything. I'm gonna do it in detail. I'm gonna do it iteratively. We're gonna be conscious of doing all these things. However, a lot of times you're doing something small, something ad hoc, something kind of unofficial. Then you only do parts of this in detail. You're really going to do all the parts. You're going to assume a lot of them away. So even if you and one or two other people are put in charge with doing something, you'll be subconsciously aware of all these things. You just won't actively do them. But these things happen all the time. Alright, how do you make sure that you're thorough and didn't miss anything? I love this book and I love this picture for obvious reasons. So you have to really think about that. And in order to make sure I don't miss anything, besides using a lot of the techniques, talking to people, luring people into my office with food to get them to think about it, using UML, using formal things, is just to wallow in the material. I listen to a lot of books and things when I'm out on 5 to 10 mile walk, and just continually putting information in my head about subjects I'm interested in allows me to see connections, and that really comes from time being engaged with the material. There are formal proofs, but usually when you know you're done is when the customer is happy. That's what drives all this. And that's true whether it's an internal or an external customer. That's a Navy thing that I worked on. I'm not going to talk about that in detail. The PhD who designed it, he was a character and a half. It's one of those things you see it, but you can't actually believe it's happening. But the thing was pretty clever, and I distilled what he did down into a simpler and more manageable form, I think. If you're doing process improvement, you can either find little changes or big quantum changes, what I call the big kill. There was a course when I went to college, it was junior year. It was called Analysis, Synthesis, and Evaluation, and they talked about that. And they always said, look, you can always improve this, that, or the other thing, and there's a place for that. But in reality, as a good analyst, as a good engineer, you're always looking for the big kill. may not always exist, but be open to. I talked before about Monte Carlo analysis. So somebody asked me up in Pittsburgh to describe that, and I came up with the example drive-in tour. Let's say I built a simulation of the route I took and all these sections and everything that could happen in between. So the weather could change. My slow-moving neighbor can pull out right in front of me. A truck can run into me. The weather could change, I said that one. There could be potholes. I could hit every red light. There could be a special event. 20 other things. And when you come to those, what you do is, that's part of data collection. So you find out for this thing, what is the chance that I'm going to get thus and such an output? And you might come up with a curve, right, of how long things will take by the frequency of occurrence. And every time I run the simulation for that, I roll a die, stick in the result for that item, and see how things go. Now, in order to get that to work, I don't want to do one run. This is stochastic. I have to do a number of runs, many times 50, maybe 100. And you might get a slight range, you might not get much variation. You might get a few cases where things go horribly wrong. And really it takes a while to understand all that. Here are some inputs, the way they look. Just what the top one will be. Here's the individual values of data I collected. There's a cumulative graph, and there's another representation of it. Now we come to the fun part. For that, let's do 3 non-software techniques you use most.
You kind of described one there, just face-to-face, sitting with the customer and not just relying on what they wrote on a piece of paper, but actually going through it and seeing if some variables are missed.
Awesome.
SWOT analysis or gap analysis?
Anyone else? All right. List off a couple of things for the last one.
The last one? Maybe performance essay? Performance essay? That one, the last question.
Wait.
The last question.
Performance assessment. Okay. Anyone else?
I was going to say modernized statements for paying contractors, like we have a 20-year-old system.
Great. So I've seen a bunch of them over the years. So I talked at the beginning about the fact that being a profession does such a wide range of things. How do we fit it all together? And I imagine us having some kind of process we map. and then trying to figure out where all the 50 BA techniques from the BABA might fit in. So, could anyone think of how business cases fit into this? Fit into a context like this?
As part of the process. You need to understand business cases to understand what the process is.
Or what you're trying to get out of the process, whether it's worth it to make a certain change to a process, whether you meet the needs. How about benchmarking? Anyone? Alright, benchmarking and market analysis is what we're doing for a process, not a simulation, but just a process we mapped and understood and proposed or built. How it compares to what other people are doing. How about data mining? There can be tons of data that come out of all this. There can be collected data about processes, about entities. For example, when we did border crossing stuff, we wouldn't get a year's worth of entry data. So we know how many gazillions of people came through from each country, what kind of conveyance, bus, commercial vehicle, privately owned vehicle, pedestrians walking through or riding bikes, how long different processes took, how often they diverted from any one process to some other process. That's a huge amount of data. One thing I found out is the Department of Homeland Security has all this data from all these ports, but their daily and hourly data that they collect, if you add it up, it doesn't add up to their 365-day data. Like, why is that? Then you have to go back and figure out where's the disconnect? Why don't they add up? And, yeah, what I'll say about that. How about scope modeling? Scope modeling.
Well, if you're trying to do a model, us just doing a simulation will kind of show you what you need to keep in scope and what might be excluded.
Right, perfect. And for example, when we did those nuclear power plant simulations, some of the more experienced people got together with the plant customers, looked at all the big process and instrumentation diagrams, and highlighted on those what things they had to include that drove stuff on the main board. And if it didn't, if it was something that was only used for a clean out, a test board, things that were part of service only when the plant is down, it wasn't part of the scope. So that can be as detailed or as not detailed as you want. So the idea is any technique you can apply it to thinking about this context. How about different software tools? about Excel. Obviously, you can use that to collect and manipulate, statistically characterize all the data you get out of this. Everything else is for communication. About non-software tools, that's basically the BA techniques again. All right, another thing that's interesting is a lot of times, like I said before, you don't do a whole process from end to end and build something new. You only do a little piece of it. So it's still part of a larger context, but you're not engaged all the way through. Now, maybe a senior analyst or manager or practitioner of some kind might do the whole thing, and different people, BAs, programmers, testers, whatever, they're only going to be doing their part, and that's fine. But somebody has to be aware of the whole part. And then there's always, in the context of thinking about things, as a process, like I showed, sometimes you're worried about what things are as opposed to what things do. Now, a hammer is a process of driving in nails or pulling them out or doing what else. Destroying desks is a favorite. But basically, that's a classic example of finding out what something has to be to make it do a certain thing.
And we should also, to interrupt, be aware of what it isn't supposed to do as well.
Yeah.
Because that has to drive those requirements. And I think a lot of times we as BAs drive that point, and developers and architects and things like that seem to forget that we were there to drive that point as well, that we have to be aware of what happens if something doesn't happen.
Yeah, totally. It's also, there was the second step or an early step of assumptions, limitations, and so on, risks. So operations, every activity, every object exists to provide some value directly or indirectly. So if you're building cars, the person who's sweeping the floor may not be contributing directly to getting that car out, but they're making the environment so that it can happen and it's valuable. Or to measure sometimes, but it's necessary. The other thing is that, again, the role of a BA is kind of nebulous. It overlaps with other roles. Used to be the programmers, and certainly this is true in small shops, had to do it all, right? You have to be able to do the analysis, discovery, testing, implementation, acceptance, communication, all of it. Now, today they call that what we do business analysis. Tomorrow they may call it something totally different. There's never going to be an end to that. One thing I find interesting when I look up ITIL or Scrum or Agile or project management or total quality management or any of those, the Wikipedia page for all of them has a section for criticism. So none of these bodies of knowledge are cut and dried. If you do this, you're gonna get a great output. That's what I actually say on my website on the landing page up at the beginning. Well, maybe you're using the latest and greatest libraries and dev tools in management philosophy, but the percentage of projects or effort or engagements that people are doing still fail the same rate. Why is that? It's because there are no hard and fast answers. You have to be present, you have to be engaged. Now, things have gotten better. There's a book I wrote called, or not wrote, but read, Facts and Fallacies of Software Engineering. It covers about 50 years of computing history. And that basically says that every new thing that people come up with, its adherence claim, it's gonna change the world. Object-oriented programming, structured programming, functional programming, Scrum, what have you. And none of them have. They maybe have a really good impact in one small area, but they advance the general field a little increment, a few percent, right? And this hasn't changed in 50 years. So really with software, what we're doing is managing more and more complex and bigger systems. And that's what all these advances have let us do. But the problems, doesn't matter what language you're using, what problem you're solving, it's still hard and you still have to talk to each other. There's nothing new. You know this book, many of you read it in grade school, Cheaper by the Dozen, about a family that had 12 kids in the early 1900s. It's by a guy named Frank Unger Gilbreth. He was the father, it was about him. There's an industry term called a thirbling, which in Gilbreth spelled backwards. And it's a small unit operation, and those with the small building block identify the processes and ways to break them down, build them back up, and make things more efficient. So that's in this book, written in the 60s, I think. One of these things, everything going on in DevOps, all the Six Sigma stuff, the PMBOK, it's all the same. So what you want to do is talk to each other, learn, pay attention, be present, and then you will come up with great solutions. Thank you.
Any questions for Bob?
That was an okay answer. I'm tired of listening to me talk to.
So how'd you get into this industry? Where did you come from?
I'm a mechanical engineer by degree, Carnegie Mellon. I've done software from the beginning. When I was there, I probably took as many computing courses mostly in Pascal, but also in C and assembly. As any other engineer there during the 4 years I was there. Numerical methods, independent projects, artificial intelligence, and all that. So I identified when I was looking for my first jobs that I wanted to do something integrating mechanical and computer systems. I've always had that interest. So, less so when I worked in paper, that was a pure banking job. And it took me everywhere from Alabama to Newfoundland to Vancouver Island. And there were some other places too in other industries. I got more and more involved in the cleaning side and the simulation stuff. So that was the perfect marriage. It turns out that seemingly 95% of the customers for simulation are government. Most of those are DoD and DHS. And after my job a couple of years ago, I decided I'm not interested in trying to figure out more efficient ways of murdering people at great expense. So now I'm trying to be in the private sector. It was tough looking at Orlando for 20 years, knowing there was a huge military simulation community here that I'd be perfect for and not be able to apply because I was trying to get out. So now I'm out and I'm not going back. I don't care what it costs me, and it's cost me a lot. This doesn't help. Anyone else? Oh, like I said, one more thing, and I want to reiterate that. A lot of stuff is about, a lot of simulation is about physical things, but it applies just as well to information, paperwork, office automation, and whatever. So it's very general, this set of skills. Can't say that often enough. I even have a page on my website that says all the jobs I've had are actually all the same, even though they might not look like it to you.
And Bob is going to be speaking at Project Summit Business Analyst World this same presentation. So we were kind of more or less, so we were kind of a chance to warm up and try out your new material.